A market exchange is a constant negotiation. Buyers naturally want to pay as little as possible to satisfy their wants, while sellers push to extract the highest price they can get for their goods. Eventually, these opposing forces have to compromise if any trade is going to happen. In economics, the point where buyers and sellers call a truce is known as market equilibrium. Let's look at this demand and supply schedule, listing the exact quantities buyers want and sellers offer. Scanning the rows, we locate where their plans align. At $175, both quantity demanded and supplied match perfectly at 550 units. Plotting this data on a graph, like diagram 2 here, we place price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal. Drawing our downward demand and upward supply curves, their crossing point is our equilibrium, the $175, 550 unit truce. At this specific intersection, the market clears perfectly. Every buyer willing to pay $175 gets the product, and every seller offering it at $175 finds a buyer. There is zero wasted product and zero unmet desire. What happens if a seller makes a pricing error and lists their product too low, say at $100 instead of $175? Looking back at our schedule, a $100 price creates a massive mismatch. Buyers want 700 units at this lower price, but sellers are only willing to supply 300. We can visualize this gap by drawing a horizontal line at the $100 mark. The distance between the supply curve and the demand curve at this price reveals a shortage of 400 units. With 700 buyers chasing 300 items, consumers compete, putting upward pressure on price. As it rises to $175, sellers produce more and buyers drop out. We trace this adjustment as a physical slide along both curves until the gap closes. Economists call this a movement along the curve. It proves that when the internal price of a good changes, the market simply slides up or down its existing tracks to restore balance. Now, compare that to an external shock, like a celebrity endorsement that increases people's desire for the product at every possible price level. Because this is a change in overall desire, the original demand curve is no longer accurate. The entire line has to physically move to a new position on the graph, similar to what we see in diagram 4. Grab a piece of paper, sketch a standard demand and supply graph, and try to draw exactly what happens to the demand curve and where the new equilibrium will land. Here is the result. Because demand increased, the entire demand curve shifts to the right, from D to D1. A new intersection forms higher up on the supply curve, giving us a new higher price at $200 and a larger quantity of 600. Notice how the mechanics operate here. Looking at the handwritten annotations on question 19, we see that while the demand curve completely shifted to a new location, the market still had to move along the stationary supply curve to reach that new equilibrium point. Mastering the difference between a movement and a shift is critical. A change in price causes a movement along a curve, but an external shock forces the entire curve to shift. Until now, we've assumed a highly competitive environment. But what happens to equilibrium when a single seller controls the entire market? A monopolist uses their market power to intentionally restrict the amount of goods they supply, keeping the product artificially scarce. We can see the effects of this distortion by looking at the graph in question 20. When supply is restricted to the lower quantity at Q1, it creates a deliberate gap between the socially desirable outcome and what the private firm chooses to produce. By artificially limiting the quantity available in the market, the monopolist forces buyers to compete for fewer items, driving the price up significantly higher than a competitive truce would allow. This is a form of market failure. The price mechanism has been manipulated by a single player, pulling the market away from its natural equilibrium and forcing consumers to pay more for less. Let's consolidate the mechanics we've covered. First, market equilibrium occurs only at the exact intersection where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Second, shortages and surpluses are temporary pricing errors. The market corrects these by sliding buyers and sellers along existing curves until they meet again. Third, real-world events that change overall desire force the entire curve to shift, establishing a brand new equilibrium. Finally, fewer competitors means supply can be restricted, resulting in higher prices and lower quantity. These visual models are the primary tools economists use to predict how everything from global shocks to local competition will impact the prices we pay.